World War II was not only a war in which the Axis powers strove to claim territory and expand influence, it was also a war of race. Around the world, people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds had decidedly different experiences during the war. For the Jews, it meant targeted annihilation. For the Asian colonial people, it meant exploitation and barbaric treatment. The United States was dealing with its own racial and ethnic tensions and inequalities. Here we will discuss the particular experiences of the Japanese Americans, African Americans, and Native Americans. When the United States entered World War II, about 120,000 people of Japanese descent, most of whom were born and raised in America, were living on the west coast of the country. While the FBI and Office of Naval Intelligence arrested about 3,000 people of Japanese ancestry suspected of espionage after Pearl Harbor, this did not quell the growing disquiet of the public. Many were influenced by the idea that the people of Japanese origin were somehow a fifth column, waiting for a signal from Tokyo to join Japan. Public sentiment quickly turned against anyone of Japanese ancestry, pressuring government officials to act. President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 that essentially gave the military free rein to remove all Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Japanese American families had just a few days to sell off the bulk of their property before reporting for relocation to one of 10 makeshift camps set up to house them. The conditions in the camps were horrible. Families shared limited living spaces, poorly insulated buildings were enclosed by barbed wire, and were under constant watchful eye of armed guards. Even under these deplorable conditions, the Japanese Americans persevered. They did their best to create a semblance of their previous lives, setting up schools, post offices, markets, and small farm plots. The Supreme Court stood poised to weigh in about the constitutionality of the camps when President Roosevelt ordered their closure in 1945. The plight of these Americans can be contrasted with the many Japanese Americans who proudly served during World War II. Japanese people made up over one-third of the total population in Hawaii, and at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, 5,000 were already drafted into the Army, and many were serving in the National Guard. The War Department formed an all-Japanese unit, albeit one with white officers, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, to serve as propaganda to counter Japanese claims of American racism. A combination of men from the camps and free Japanese American Hawaiians stepped forward to join. Japanese Americans recruited by the Military Intelligence Service worked as translators across all the major battlefields in the South Pacific, providing critical help interrogating prisoners and translating intercepted communications. Overall, these soldiers received numerous decorations, including nearly 10,000 Purple Hearts. It is estimated that over 33,000 Japanese Americans served in the military during World War II. The divide between black and white Americans became clearer during World War II, and it forced the government to consider equal treatment of African Americans, both at home and in the military. Almost 1 million African Americans joined the military, and thousands of black women served in the women's auxiliaries. On the home front, folks relocated to pursue job opportunities in the defense industry. For many African American men and women, holding a skilled job changed their lives forever after. Draft boards consisted mostly of all white members who often passed over African Americans. The NAACP pressured President Roosevelt to make changes, and the number of African Americans in the armed forces did begin to grow significantly during the war years. Most African Americans who served early in the war years worked behind the scenes in support roles, such as maintenance, supply, and grave digging, segregated from the fighting forces. The Army was forced to put more African Americans into fighting positions after suffering heavy losses. 2,000 black soldiers hit the beaches at Normandy as part of a barrage balloon battalion, and many others fought at the Battle of the Bulge, or delivered much-needed supplies to Patton through the Red Ball Express. The famous Tuskegee Airmen flew almost 15,000 missions in Italy, earning many citations and awards. In January 1942, James Thompson wrote to a popular black newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, proposing that black Americans fight for a double V victory, to beat oppressors both here and abroad. The editors agreed and soon released the WV insignia and encouraged Black Americans to get behind the war effort, but also to stand up for equal rights granted to every other American. By the end of the war, over 900,000 Black Americans proudly served in the military, becoming part of the great arsenal of democracy that won the war. Many returned stateside to find continued segregation and discrimination. The single V victory for equal treatment remained elusive. Their quest gave rise to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. African Americans peacefully fought alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to bring a permanent end to discrimination. 44,000 Native Americans served in World War II. This is about 10% of the Native American population. The majority joined voluntarily after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, spurred on by tribal leaders who believed that warriors should participate of their own free will. Having just been granted citizenship in 1924, it is remarkable how quickly Native Americans set aside their grievances with white America to pick up arms to defend the country. By the end of the war, nearly 99% of all Native Americans eligible for the draft had registered. They left home to distinguish themselves in all branches of the military. The Native Americans were particularly respected by the Marines that they worked with throughout the South Pacific because of their bravery, excellent marksmanship, and perseverance. Native Americans were awarded many medals and honors, including 3 Congressional Medals of Honor, the highest military award granted in the United States. By the end of the war, over 400 members of the Navajo and other tribes had played a critical role for the Allies, serving as code talkers, confusing the enemy with the tone and syntax of their indigenous languages. Working in teams called telephone squads, groups of Native Americans used their languages to develop secret battle communications, which the enemy was never able to decipher. Native Americans were also excellent soldiers and scouts. The war correspondent Ernie Pyle once described witnessing the 1st Division Navajos put on a ceremonial dance before heading to Okinawa. After the war, many Native Americans decided to leave the reservation, using the skills they had learned during the war to achieve greater success elsewhere. Many took advantage of the veteran benefits such as the GI Bill, short-term unemployment assistance, and reduced-rate mortgages. Others returned to the security and familiarity of the reservation. When the war ended, white American GIs returning home expected that life would go back to normal, as it had been prior to the war. Japanese Americans assimilated back into everyday life. Some Native Americans used the war as a stepping stone to try life away from the reservation, using GI Bill benefits to help with a transition. For African Americans who had gained some ground in the fight against discrimination, new skills, and job opportunities during the war years, this would come to a temporary standstill after the war. While America was unable to end segregation and discrimination immediately after the war, African Americans did not give up. Rather, they continued in their quest to end racial injustice, and they used their new opportunities experienced during World War II as a catalyst for the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The United States government passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, peacefully ending segregation and making discrimination illegal. This benefited not only African Americans, but countless others.